Talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. A question was asked by a monk about how to prevent the mind from being distracted. Maharshi, you see the objects on forgetting your own self. If you keep hold of yourself, you will not see the objective world. When asked if occult powers or siddhis can be achieved, along with omnipotence or Ishwaratva, as mentioned in the last verse of Dakshinamurti Stotram, Maharshi said, let omnipotence be accomplished first, and then the question may be raised. Can anyone benefit by repeating sacred syllables or mantra picked up casually? Maharshi replied, no. He must be competent and initiated in such mantras. Maharshi illustrated this by the following story. A king visited his premier in his residence. There he was told that the premier was engaged in repetition of sacred syllables or japa. The king waited for him and on meeting him, asked what the japa was. The premier said that it was the holiest of all, Gayatri. The king desired to be initiated by the premier, but the premier confessed his inability to initiate him. Therefore, the king learnt it from someone else, and meeting the minister later, he repeated the Gayatri and wanted to know if it was right. The minister said that the mantra was correct, but it was not proper for him to say it. When pressed for an explanation, the minister called to a man close by and ordered him to take hold of the king. The order was not obeyed. The order was often repeated and still not obeyed. The king flew into a rage and ordered the same man to hold the minister, and it was immediately done. The minister laughed and said that the incident was the explanation required by the king. How? Asked the king. The minister replied, the order was the same and the executor also, but the authority was different. When I ordered, the effect was nil, whereas when you ordered, there was immediate effect. Similarly with the mantras. Someone inquired, why is it said in scriptures that the sage is like a child? Maharshi replied, a child and a sage, that is Agnani, are similar in a way. Incidents interest a child only as long as they last. He ceases to think of them after they have passed away. So then, it is apparent that they do not leave any impression on the child and it is not affected by them mentally. So it is with a sage. A visitor asked how to realize oneself in accordance with Maharshi's instructions contained in his text of Truth Revealed, verse number 9. The difficulty was in controlling the mind. Maharshi replied, it is to be done by controlling the breath. If you practice it by yourself without other help, then the mind is controlled. Otherwise, the mind comes under control spontaneously in the presence of a superior power. Such is the greatness of association with the wise, or satsanga. Can destiny or karma ever come to an end? Maharshi replied, the karmas carry the seeds of their own destruction in themselves. A man asked the Maharshi to say something to him. When asked what he wanted to know, he said that he knew nothing and wanted to hear something from the Maharshi. Maharshi replied, you know that you know nothing. Find out that knowledge. That is liberation or mukti. 6th January 1935. Mrs. M. A. Pigott, an English lady, who had read Search in Secret India, came to see the Maharshi. The services of a disciple as interpreter were provided. There were many visitors at the time in the hall, including some ladies with their infants. The place resounded with noise. At length silence prevailed. Suddenly Maharshi, who seemed to be looking at infinite space, was heard to say softly, "Monkey!" A little boy was then discovered in the doorway, unobserved by the mother who was seated on the other side of the door, with a large monkey standing on his hind legs, who with both hands was fondling the child, not hurting it in the slightest, both being at peace with each other in Maharshi's presence. When Maharshi's voice was heard, the monkey jumped away adroitly and disappeared. The incident greatly impressed the lady. 5th January 1935. Is a master necessary for realization? Mrs. Pigott asked first. Maharshi replied, the realization is the result of the master's grace, more than teachings, lectures, meditations, etc. They are only secondary aids, whereas the former is the primary and the essential cause. Devotee. What are the obstacles which hinder realization of the self? Maharshi. They are habits of mind, or vasanas. Devotee. How to overcome the mental habits then? Maharshi. By realizing the self. This is a vicious cycle, replied the devotee. Then Maharshi said, it is the ego which raises such difficulties, creating obstacles, and then suffers from the perplexity of apparent paradoxes. Find out who makes the inquiries and the self will be found. Devotee replied, what are the aids for realization? Maharshi. The teaching of the scriptures and of the realized souls. Can such teachings be discussed in discussions, lectures, and meditations? Asked the devotee. Maharshi replied, yes, all these are only secondary aids, whereas the essential is the master's grace. Devotee. How long will it take for one to get that? Maharshi. Why do you desire to know? To give me hope, replied the devotee. Then Maharshi said, even such a desire is an obstacle. The self is ever there. There is nothing without it. Be the self, and the desires and doubts will disappear. Such self is the witness in sleep, dream, and waking states of existence. These states belong to the ego. The self transcends even the ego. Did you not exist in sleep? Did you know that you were asleep or unaware of the world? It is only in the waking state that you describe the experience of sleep as being unawareness. Therefore, the consciousness when asleep is the same as that when you are awake. If you know what this waking consciousness is, you will know the consciousness which witnesses all the three states. Such consciousness could be found by seeking the consciousness as it was in sleep. Devotee. In that case, I fall asleep. Maharshi. No harm. Devotee. It is a blank. Maharshi replied, "For whom is the blank? Find out. You cannot deny yourself at any time. The self is ever there and continues in all states." Devotee: "Should I remain as if in sleep and be watchful at the same time?" Maharshi: "Yes, watchfulness is the waking state. Therefore, the state will not be of sleep, but sleepless sleep. If you go the way of your thoughts, you will be carried away by them, and you will find yourself in an endless maze." Devotee: "So then, I must go back tracing the source of thoughts." "Quite so," said the Maharshi. "In that way, thoughts will disappear and the self alone will remain. In fact, there is no inside or outside for the self. They are all projections of the ego. The self is pure and absolute." Devotee: "It is understood intellectually only. Is not intellect a help for realization?" Maharshi: "Yes, up to a certain stage. Even so, realize that the self transcends the intellect. The latter must itself vanish to reach the self." Devotee: "Does my realization help others?" Maharshi replied, "Yes, certainly. It is the best possible help. But there are no others to be helped, for a realized being sees the self just like a goldsmith estimating the gold in various jewels. When you identify yourself with the body, then only the forms and shapes are there. But when you transcend your body, the others disappear along with your own body consciousness." Devotee: "Is it so with plants, trees, etc.?" Maharshi: "Do they exist at all apart from the self? Find it out. You think that you see them. The thought is projected out from yourself. Find out where from it arises. Thoughts will cease to rise, and the self alone will remain." Devotee replied, "I understand theoretically, but they are still there." Maharshi replied, "Yes, it is like a cinema show. There is light on the screen, and the shadows flitting across impress the audience as the enactment of some piece. Similarly also will it be if in the same play an audience also is shown. The seer, the seen, will then only be the screen. Apply it to yourself. You are the screen. The self has created the ego. The ego has its assertions of thoughts which are displayed as the world, the plants, the trees, etc., of which you are asking. In reality, all these are nothing but the self. If you see the self, the same will be found to be all, everywhere and always. Nothing but the self exists." Devotee: "Yes, I still understand only theoretically. Yet the answers are simple and beautiful and convincing." Maharshi: "Even the thought I do not realize is a hindrance. In fact, self alone is." End of talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi.